You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll explore how the e-commerce landscape in Africa is evolving and trends to watch out for this year. As always, you can join today's conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can also send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle. It's at Esther Awoniyi. Now, as competition in Africa's e-commerce market heats up, Juliet Anammah, Chairwoman of the Jumia Nigeria and Head of Institutional Affairs at Jumia Group, joins me as we explore how the space is changing and trends to expect this year and, of course, beyond. Thank you, Juliet. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much.
Quite an eventful year for Jumia in 2019, but I want us to start with just looking at the e-commerce space in Africa in 2019. What would you say, apart from, of course, developments within Jumia, but especially around competition, how would you say that played out in 2019?
Thank you very much. I think the landscape is one where we see a lot of growth, and it's one where we see e-commerce continuing to make strides, and we see that the trajectory is in line with what we had projected. And for us, I think one of the things I'd like to talk about is what are the things we did in 2019, specifically in Nigeria, if I use Nigeria as an example. In 2019, for example, the Jumia app was the most downloaded app in Nigeria. In 2019, we were able to reach consumers in more remote areas like Bonny Island, for example. 2019, we extended e-commerce opportunities for consumers in Ibadan, places like Edo State. In 2019 also is a year where we opened up more e-commerce opportunities for 15 cities that had very limited access to prepayment solutions. So in the northern part of Nigeria and the southeastern part of Nigeria. Those are things that for me, are much more critical. We also looked at expanding our logistics. We had about 30 more logistics partners that we integrated. We opened 50 more logistics hubs, last mile delivery hubs. Okay. So allowing us to be able to connect more sellers to more consumers. We launched new campaigns, International Sneakers Day. We launched Jumia Mall, bringing brands to have a home on Jumia. Those are things that for me are possibly much more valuable. But
it's sort of like almost a sharp contrast to, those headlines that we saw last year, apart from, of course, that IPO that, of course, grabbed a lot of headlines. But subsequent developments within the space, of course, within Jumia too, was what we saw grabbing those headlines, those exits in a number of African markets, and such as Rwanda, Cameroon, I think the Jumia travel even here in Nigeria, and one or two other markets. But what we're hearing, what was out there was that it would appear, according to analysts, some of them that I actually also spoke to, it would appear that Jumia may not have properly studied the African market, and it's probably taken, that's for the exit now, taken a step back to properly study and evaluate those markets. Because if you just look, in some of those countries, Cameroon, even Tanzania, Cameroon especially, just looking at economic growth versus how developed the logistics business, and of course, the percentage of internet usage, and even smartphones, one looks at it and one says, and one could say, oh, okay, fine. Maybe that's why, a business such as Jumia would struggle, in the first place. So why not take a step back? So those were the kinds of analysis and comments that we heard last year. But for you, I'd like to hear from you. Would you say that in those markets, Jumia having to take a step back, that was the reason? Looking at the market and you said, you know what, we just need to take a step back. We may come back, but we need to just reevaluate this portfolio.
I think I will take it from two perspectives. When you mentioned that people say, for example, that, are we sure there's an opportunity there? Should we have entered it? It's pretty much the same as when we started. It was also the same sentiment. There were some sentiments that is e-commerce possibly in Africa? Yeah. So, but 8 years, this will be the 8th year now down the road. Clearly, e-commerce is possible in Africa. Like I mentioned earlier, it is growing in Africa. At some point, people also said, campaigns like Black Friday, does it really resonate in Africa? It does. Now, it doesn't mean that as we execute, that we don't make strategic choices. We have to keep making strategic choices. We have to keep reshaping our portfolio and making sure that at every point in time, we're optimizing the capacity that we have, capacity both in terms of financing as also in terms of management, a capacity to run the business and all that. and making those choices, again, like you mentioned, and you're rightly so, also evaluating the macro. So sometimes you enter a specific geography and the macro supports that decision. And then if you see where the macro also doesn't support that decision, you again reevaluate your portfolio. So that's what we have to keep doing anyway. That's part of how we manage the business.
But has the strategy, because it would also appear that the strategy has been to prioritize growth over profitability. Is that still the strategy? The strategy
actually has always been to balance multiple factors.
Okay.
So like, I was saying to someone earlier, I said, look, you can decide to just grow. Okay, you can grow 2,000%, 3,000%. But then how do you, if you don't look at profitability, of course you can grow. You can always grow at whatever percentage you put out there. But we balance multiple things, growth, as well as, and we call it profitable usage. So what is important to us today is what is profitable usage. So we're balancing growth, we're balancing it with cost efficiencies, both on the marketing side, on fixed cost side. We're also balancing it with monetization, because when you're growing e-commerce, you're providing a platform for sellers. You're providing a platform for consumers and sellers to transact. And therefore, as you create more value for them, as you provide more services for them, you're also able to monetize that. But you don't monetize too early. I mean, you have to balance this thing. So it's always those four things in tandem. And that's been our strategy, and that continues to be our strategy in 2020.
A lot of people have been wondering and asking also with those exits that we saw towards the end of last year. And I think one of the ones the one that was perhaps a big surprise was Rwanda. Everyone is wondering, will there be will there be more exits this year? And two, after having taken a step back from those markets, is there a possibility that there could be a return to those markets?
Potentially, it could be. Like I said, it will always be defined and determined by a strategic choice around, like I said, the four pillars. It's growth, monetization, cost efficiency, as well as, of course, Jumia Pay, also ensuring that we're entrenching prepayment efficiency on our platform. But then also looking at the macros. The macros keep changing. Africa is dynamic. So as we look at the macro environment, as we look at the capacity that we have and all the resources that we have available, our ability to launch logistics, our ability to grow Jumia Pay online payments in different markets, we will keep reevaluating that decision. And nothing is off the table. We could enter more markets. We could also take some strategic decisions to exit.
I'd like to hear your perspective on the African logistics market. It's very difficult. I mean, I know Nigeria, obviously, for instance, is your biggest market. And if you just look at the logistics landscape here, it's very tricky, it's very difficult, and has tested even the biggest. I mean, I'm sure you have, of course, your side of the story to tell too. But I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the logistics business since you entered? Has it gotten any better? What's different now? And for those who may be thinking, okay, let's come in here, what would you say to them?
Is it easier? Hell no, it's not easier for sure. But is there an opportunity for it to grow? Of course there's an opportunity for it to grow. I just gave the examples that even just last year we added 30 new logistics partners to our network. We opened 50 more last mile delivery hubs so that we could reach consumers. The thing is, we have a different model in Africa. If you look at it from the mindset of, I just want one or two very large logistics operators covering every nook and cranny of Africa, you're not going to have that. But if you go with our model, which is what we realized from the beginning and what we set up from the beginning to support our e-commerce, which was you're going to have an integrated network, you're going to build the systems, you're going to build processes, you're going to build tools, and then you're going to integrate logistics partners, people who have the assets. So it's a combination of that ecosystem that makes it work. Someone who has assets of motorcycles, someone who has assets of trucks and vans, and those people are then integrated into a network, and you have a shared database where you're sharing access to data, you're sharing access to route planning, to tools, delivery methodologies. All of those things is what makes it work. And that takes some time to build, but good thing is we built it, so now we can leverage it to grow.
So for your 2020 playbook, what can we expect? especially for Nigeria, your biggest market? Are you going to see more of those expansions and partnerships?
Certainly. So more of those expansions and partnerships, more of being relevant to our consumers, building profitable usage of Jumia, expanding the reach of the kinds of products and services that consumers can access on Jumia, expanding also for our sellers in terms of the kinds of services we provide for them. Third-party logistics is something we're also opening up to sellers to say, look, if you also have your deliveries that are not items that were ordered on Jumia, you can actually use our logistics network to make that happen. So we're doing that. We're also seeing sellers who are interested in using our platform and say, look, can you guys connect us to supply chains outside of Africa? We see a lot of that, and most of those things will be the trends that we expect to see in 2020.
Now, back to the macro, I imagine obviously you're still keeping your eye on the Nigerian economy for this year, and growth projections are not encouraging. 2.1, 2.5, at best is what is being projected and forecast for this year. Although we're going to see that increase in the minimum wage. Hopefully all the states will end up implementing it. There's still pressure on the consumer wallet. Is that something you're keeping track of? Does that make you nervous? Are you putting that, taking cognizance of that into your strategy?
Oh yes, certainly. I think one thing it makes us realize is that, we went through it in 2016 when we had to step back and say what exactly is relevant for the consumer. What does the consumer really want to buy? Because ultimately, the wallet of the consumer makes a choice of what they want to use that money to buy. And what we want to make sure is that whatever the consumer needs to use that wallet to buy, that we have products, we have the right kinds of services that are relevant to them. Whether it is airtime or paying their bills or buying school items for their children, or it's groceries for the home, that we can bring them the best prices and the best assortment, the widest assortment that fulfills their needs. So as long as we're focused on that, as long as we're focused on that, we see tremendous growth still, even in 2020, and that's what we're projecting.
Just one more step back into 2019. What would you say for the Nigerian market now? What would you say was the biggest challenge for Jumia in the Nigerian market? I know you did close the Jumia Travel, but perhaps apart from that, what would you say was the biggest challenge?
I would rather say what was the biggest opportunity areas that we saw, and it sounds very. I mentioned it earlier, but to me it's quite interesting that in a place like Bonny Island, that you actually have to transport goods by water transportation, that we're able to have a logistics network that can deliver goods to consumers there. Those kinds of things I find interesting. And those are the kinds of things that I rather stick out for me in 2019 and say, look, if we can do this, we can actually reach more places in Nigeria, and we can actually reach more consumers in the country.
If you're just joining us, Juliet Anammah, Chairwoman of Jumia Nigeria, is our guest on Beyond Markets, and we have been exploring Africa's online retail market. Juliet, thank you for your time so far.
Thank you.
Let's quickly talk about, of course, we're talking 2020 now, and some of those management changes that are going to happen or perhaps have happened already. Could you just quickly walk us through that? Management changes are always very internal things, but really what we've done is just make our organization flatter, so that we can also make sure that speed of decision making is much faster. People can access information much more nimbly across Africa. And then specifically in Nigeria also, like you mentioned now, I'm the chairwoman of Jumia Nigeria. It's a responsibility that also makes sure that I'm still having oversight over the country and making sure that all the key strategic decisions that happen in Nigeria, that with my experience being the CEO of Nigeria, that I can contribute there. A colleague of mine will be coming in to be the CEO of Nigeria. And we will be talking about him quite shortly, and that's it really. And then also in addition to that, we're now a public company, and so there are many things that are now very important for us.
beyond growth, monetization, beyond managing our cost efficiencies, all things, good things that we need to do to deliver on our mandate. It's also making sure that we're socially making the right level of impact, and that in all the countries we operate in Africa, that from a regulatory perspective, from an institutional perspective, that we're well positioned. And that's a new role that I'll be taking on for the rest of the countries where we operate.
Speaking about a strategy, I knew that for Jumia, you've been on that journey to profitability.
Yeah.
And of course, as you mentioned earlier, the strategy has been not just to prioritize growth, but balance it out across the board.
Yeah.
But then there's still that cash burn going on. I'm just wondering, are we going to see that reduce this year? And how closer are you now, the company, to profitability?
I mean, we made a definite decision in terms of what we want to achieve and what we've also promised as shareholders. And what we see is that we continue to deliver on that mandate year on year. Okay, so our business plan in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of cost efficiency, if you look at our G&A, if you look at our marketing spend per annum, what we want to achieve in terms of monetization, that as long as we're on track, we're good. And that's what we see at the moment. So even in 2020, we continue to maintain the trajectory that we have shared in our business plans.
I'm just also wondering how investors feel also about the company. And talking to an analyst earlier, sometime last year, we also talked about perception about the company. Of course, that successful IPO, like I said, grabbed headlines. But then as of November last year, the stock was down about 77%. I mean, just thinking about that, that high, coming from that high, and then having to, take a bit of a beating and all that. How are you processing that as a company? And for those who may have, because it would appear that there's a certain perception that, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, that Jumia may not have studied its market, and there may be some cracks here and there in the strategy, in the going as you head towards profitability. How are you processing that as a company?
Good question, and the way we look at it is, look, when it comes to the market is the market. Okay, what we are in control of and what we remain in control of and what we want to keep focusing on are the things that we can do. And the things we can certainly do are the things we talked about. Okay, now it sounds boring because I keep repeating it, but that's a reality. What we can control is the growth. What we can control is how do we monetize the platform. What we can control is how do we manage our cost efficiency. What we can control is how do we ensure that we keep developing Jumia Pay into a strong solution for online payments in Africa. And those things in the end, yes, they all deliver the mandate. They deliver the value that we create for shareholders and for all the stakeholders in Jumia. That's the most important thing. And now going into the IPO, of course, we always knew that the markets go up and down, and we were quite prepared. We work in Africa, and I'm African. I know already that
77%, that's a bit steep.
Yeah, but hey, that's a reality. And we are playing a long-term game here. We started, 7 years ago. Now this is 8th year, and we always knew it was never going to be a short-term sprint. Okay, so the perspective we bring is a long-term game, but as long as we stay focused on the things that are relevant. There are many things that could happen. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but hey, the important thing is what are the things that are relevant, what are the things that actually create value. If we concentrate on that, we're certain that even our shareholders and communities we serve will see the value that we're creating, and someday to reflect. Yeah.
So Jumia, as it stands right now, you are happy with your current strategy
yes,
towards
definitely.
Growth. So none of those things that happened in 2019, you weren't blindsided by any of those events?
No, because when things happen, you relook your portfolio, you look at your strategy and say, does this strategy make sense? Okay. At this point in Africa, at the level of growth phase we're in, with the opportunities we see in the market, with the macro context of the African continent, the strategy we have is the right strategy for this market.
Okay, for going forward into this year, trends, what can we expect from the market? Obviously, you sound prepared, and being a market leader too, I suppose that's not surprising. But for trends that we should expect in 2020, maybe from the logistics arms, I don't know, whatever within the space, what can we expect?
I would say the things we're looking forward to see how they will shape out and how we can also leverage that and actually contribute more to the development on the continent. For example, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there could be potentials there for actually e-commerce is probably one of the ways in which you can make it even faster for the continent, because online transactions are transparent, they are traceable and all that. I mentioned earlier in terms of seeing how our platform can also be a way in which we can connect sellers on the continent to supply chains outside of Africa. So there are many things we're seeing. The eco currency is being discussed. Who knows? But these are things we're watching and seeing how does a platform like ours, how can it support in those kinds of initiatives? Cashless payments, of course, is very important for the government in Nigeria, and the more we develop Jumia Pay, the more we ensure that Jumia Pay is a strong payment channel that people can be able to make prepayments, the more we are integrated into the requirements of the local environments that we operate in. I think those things are things we're watching and seeing how we plug in and make our own contributions.
Now, since you came on board in 2012, what would you say have been some of those the biggest lessons you've learned from the African e-commerce market, and what the market has told you, perhaps continues to tell you about the African consumer? I think those are two questions there. Yeah. The biggest lessons from the e-commerce market, what it has told you about who the African consumer is?
If you ask me personally on the first one, the first one is a very African thing, that never take no for an answer. Right? I mean, as corny as it sounds, but that's the reality, that our market is so dynamic. Our market is so, never look at Africa and you say, oh, it's never going to work. It's not possible. The reality is that it is possible within a certain framework. And it's your responsibility as an entrepreneur to figure out what is the framework that works here. Okay. So that's the first thing we learned, that it works. It's just that there's got to be a framework that makes it possible. There's got to be a certain operating model that makes it possible. And if you can crack that, you can make it work. And that's what we've done so far, and we want to keep doing. The second part you asked was,
the African
consumer? Yes, the African consumer is very hungry for innovation. The African consumer wants people who can provide solutions to their everyday life. I had sellers in 2015, 2016 when I joined. They were only doing 500,000 naira. Today they're doing 8 million naira a month. And these are small shops. They've expanded. Now they have production. They're thinking about, how do I get my fabrics? From where do I get it? Can you guys help me get my fabrics from China or from other markets? So people, the consumer is hungry, is just looking for solutions that can address their specific needs. And that's our responsibility. That's our responsibility as entrepreneurs. That's our responsibility as people who run businesses in Africa, to figure out, how does it work? It's not for us to poach and plug in solutions that worked elsewhere. They're not always plug and play in Africa.
I'd like you to look into your crystal ball now. Just look maybe 5 years down ahead. How do you see this market evolving? Keeping in mind those challenges that are still persistent. And I don't know, we don't know to what extent they will reduce, and all of that. But for you, what do you see?
There's one word I use all the time when I talk about Africa, and that's ecosystem. And it's so true. Okay, every successful business in Africa, at least the ones that I've looked at, I track, survives in a specific ecosystem, because they've figured out it's not just your company, right? What is the ecosystem that supports it? Okay. So logistics is an example. I shared with you and I described what the ecosystem looks at. In the next 5 years, it's our responsibility to keep figuring out what other parts of ecosystems do we need to build that can keep, supporting and helping the shaping of e-commerce, the shaping of digital online. It's not just e-commerce, digital transactions to keep growing in Africa. Ultimately, what I want to see in 5 years and 6 years is that we are so relevant, not only to the consumer and sellers, which is where we started, We're relevant to the communities. We're relevant even to the governments, because the governments recognize that they can leverage digital much more than they can see now. It's our responsibility to educate. It's our responsibility to create those kinds of ecosystems, bring in the right partnerships to make it work across Africa. That's what I see is our responsibility, and that's what I want to see in 5 years. I want to see e-commerce. I want to see digital transactions growing from where we are today, maybe 1%, 2% to maybe 10%, 15%, whatever. But really, it's identifying the kinds of ecosystems and partnerships that we build to make it work. Okay. That's what I see.
Finally, we have just 1 minute left. Yeah. What's it been like for you while you were CEO of the company, championing or leading this company with a very, very troubled, difficult African market waters, as it were?
Well, as a mom who's raised 4 children, I know that sometimes you wake up in the morning and the kids are, all bright and cheery, and sometimes you wake up in the morning and they got fever and you have to attend to that. So it's been an amazing journey. It's a very fulfilling journey. It's been a rewarding journey. It's been one where I have learned so much. I've also grown so much because I've been in many kinds of situations that I've had to deal with, right? So for me, that's the learning ultimately, because I've learned everything that I've put into my kitty that's helping me to now move on to the next level. So it's been amazing. Thank you.
Juliet, thank you so much. And of course, all the best in your new role. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.
I've been speaking to Juliet Anammah. She's the chairwoman of Jumia Nigeria and head of institutional affairs at Jumia Group. We've been talking about, of course, the e-commerce landscape in Africa and what to expect this year. That's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And of course, you can follow and send tweets to my Twitter handle. It's at Esther Awoniyi. For myself and the team, do have a great day.